I am a firm believer that no child is born bad. And I would even go as far as to say that all children, including those who have made horrible mistakes, deserve another chance for positive change. When I was 13 years old, I was arrested, charged, and later convicted to serve a 25-year sentence in prison for my involvement in a gang-related first-degree murder. Although I was a child, and although I was not the actual killer, because I had an extensive juvenile arrest record and I was just as responsible, it made it easy for the judge to transfer my case over to the adult criminal court, a courtroom in which, unfortunately, I was forced to face consequences that were basically designed for the worst of the worst adult offenders. However, unlike many had expected, after 13 years in prison, I came out at age 27 with a bachelor's degree, a remorseful heart, and a mission to advocate for at-risk youth. Today, I'm 38 years old, and for the rest of my life will forever be dedicated to the victim and his family as I push forward as a youth advocate and trying to help deter children from making the same mistakes that I once made. Soon after I was released from prison, I would say it was at the time, it was fall, the following spring, I got involved with Roosevelt University. I got back and I received a Master's of Arts in Counseling and Human Services. Soon after that, I got involved in working with social service agencies and working with at-risk youth. And for the past 12 years, I've worked in positions that were designed to help basically keep children out of the criminal justice system. And throughout the course of that work, I came to find that not only were these children's lives much like my own, but that in fact, many of them, unfortunately, were victims as well. Victims, unfortunately, of situations that made it hard for them to succeed in the first place. A little bit more about myself. I was raised in the backyards neighborhood, in a impoverished community in the south side of Chicago. A neighborhood that was once made famous by Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which vividly depicted the harrowing poverty, diseases, and working conditions of migrants in the stockyards in the turn of the 20th century. But unfortunately today, my neighborhood today is still contained with poverty, but in the media is mostly known for violence, crimes, and drugs. Personally, my earliest childhood memory begins not long after this photo was taken. I was 6 years old. At the time, I was probably, my sisters and I, we were, I guess you could say in some ways, living a typical life, but at the same time, there were things going on inside our home that even my memory cannot fully grasp. According to my mother, she said that my father was, my stepfather was just as abusive as my father, and my memory begins when I was sitting in the back seat of a police car along with my two sisters and my brother, and I remember looking out the back window as we witnessed my mother crying in tears. It was a police car, and when we looked out the back window, we saw the image of my mother getting smaller and smaller, but she tried to fight to stop them from taking us away. It turns out that when they found out about the abuse, they arrested my stepfather. They deemed our home unsafe, and they placed us all into foster care. I will never forget how our foster mother, who didn't believe in allowing us to have toys, unfortunately confined us mostly to our rooms with no television and no radio. I will never forget how early on in my experience of childhood, being denied the natural and normal procession of learning, we were subjected to work in our home, unfortunately, hour after hour. Feeding scary dogs, tending to her garden. To this very day, I would never eat an eggplant. I know it sounds funny, but it is so, the images and memories that I have are so strong of this experience. And the reason why is because this was a part of my life that should have been safe. A part of every child's life that should have been safe. And what happened for us, coming from out of that situation and coming back home, what we thought would be a very safe and nurturing environment, hopefully after having dealt with the case managing with my family or my mother, came to realize that my stepfather was even more abusive. When we arrived home, we were so exhilarated and happy to be home. But within time, we realized that my stepfather had a drinking problem. And he would come home after late night hours of drinking, and mostly on Friday nights, and he would never hesitate to walk in, hit my mother, beat us, and kick our dog. I will never forget how we struggled with poverty, growing up in an environment that was so desperate that at times we didn't have light, and we didn't have gas. I remember times when we had to move from one location to the next because unfortunately, my mother could not afford to pay the bills and we were always faced with evictions. I'll never forget how my brother, when I walked into the washroom, he was laying in the tub and the water was up to his chest and he was fully clothed and he was watching bubbles come up and he said the spirits were attacking his legs. I will never forget how years later I will come to discover that even my mother contended with schizophrenia and depression. Just recently, I started a new position with the Campaign for Fair Sentencing of Youth as a Youth Justice Advocate. But for the past 5.5 years, I had the ability to work with a one-of-a-kind longitudinal study, which is the Northwestern Juvenile Project here at Northwestern. And throughout the course of that work, I came to find that many of these individuals had similar upbringings to mine. And according to the Northwestern Juvenile Project, some of the findings, which were really a mirror of my life, went on to say that 93% of the kids who had entered into juvenile detention had experienced one or more traumas prior to baseline. 4 out of 5 had endorsed or had conveyed ever having been physically abused. 66% of the males and 74% of the females had met diagnostic criteria for one or more psychiatric disorders, including the associated impairments. 1 out of 10 had ever attempted to commit suicide. But these are the realities that when a child stands in front of the courtroom, that unfortunately are very, very seldomly spoken of. And one thing that I also came to realize, being someone who was once in the system, that disproportionately, those who are getting arrested are young African-American and Latino males. And I believe that is the case mostly because these are the kids that come from environments that unfortunately have been virtually abandoned. Poor and disinvested communities. The kids that I met had came from Inglewood, back of the yards, the Henry Hornets when they were still existing. The majority of us had came from environments that truly lacked quality education, educational opportunities that would lead into employment, unfortunately, were non-existent. Positive youth development programs that would help guide a child in the right direction were virtually non-existent. Financial struggle of families and despair was a dominant theme of my life and the lives of my friends. And so for us, growing up in that type of environment, and perhaps them as well contending with life situations at home that were not as safe as they should have been, unfortunately for me, it was only natural for me to become part of a gang. Coming out of that environment and realizing that I felt safer in the streets than I did within my own home, it became a natural procession of events. I don't even remember the day I joined the gang, to be honest with you. And what I mean by that is, it was something that sort of evolved over time, and it was solely based upon the most basic and fundamental human needs that we all share. The need for love, the need for safety, the need for a sense of belonging and respect. And for me, what made gangs so enticing for me is that gangs were way more advanced than any social institution within my reach in terms of satisfying the most basic and fundamental human needs that I had as a child. And what happened, of course, within time, I came to realize as a child, being as oblivious as I was to the future consequences, I eventually found myself in situations that I had to question, what am I doing? Even at times I questioned, what was I doing? I remember one of the guys, he had walked up to me, and he had a gun, and he said, "Here, man, take this gun. We need you to get on security." And I remember grabbing the gun, and I didn't even know what to do with the gun. I never held a real gun. I had a cap gun before. I never held a real gun. But I did what I saw on television. I did what I had always seen on the screen. So I put it in my waistband. And I remember walking across the street, standing where he told me to stand. And on the surface, it made it like I was being tough, like I was going above and beyond to prove that I was worthy of my gang. But deep down, I was scared inside. So I kept thinking, what if I shoot that's gonna hurt, you know? But that must have been some type of premonition, because soon after that happened, within days, one of my best friends and I, as well as 2 other kids, were hanging out in the back of an alley, and we had access to one of the guns that was provided by the gang. And I remember him grabbing it, and we were playing with it. And within a moment, I heard boom, and suddenly within that moment, everything went in. It warped in and back out of slow motion and darkness, and I realized that I had been shot in my face beneath my left eye. And when the bullet entered my face, it shattered the bone, it sent fragments in every direction, it traveled through my sinus, it lodged behind my left ear. I had blood rushing out of my mouth, out of my nose, down the back of my throat, and I remember thinking to myself, swallow the blood. I thought that if I swallowed the blood, it would stop me from bleeding to death. And I look back upon my life and I question myself, why? Why did I put myself in those situations? And I remember being in the back of the ambulance looking up, and they had the bright light in my face, very much like this light. And they're saying, put this, they're like, follow my finger. Where did the bullet come out? Where did it go in? Asking my name, what year it was. And I remember the police walking over and standing above me and saying, who shot you? And then within that moment, I had to decide, do I tell on my friend who just shot me in my face by accident? It was an accident. And all my life I had been raised not to tell on my friends. And even there, while I was laying on what could have been my deathbed, I couldn't bring myself to do that. And I said it was a man in a black car. I was probably thinking about the Knight Rider or something. I don't know what I was thinking. But I said it was a man in a black car. So they went through the whole neighborhood. They were chasing every car, pulling him over, every black car. They were questioning him. Where were you at? What were you doing at this time of the hour? And then they realized, like, wait a minute. Perhaps they put two and two together because the Knight Rider never carried a gun, you know? So they probably say, wait, this story's not matching up. So they asked one of my friends that was there, and he told the truth. He didn't have a script. He didn't know what I told him, so he told the truth. And so they came to the hospital, they looked at me, and they said, we'll talk to you soon. I knew for a fact that something was going to happen. I didn't know quite what it was, but I knew I was probably going to be in some trouble. So about a week and a half later, while I'm walking through my neighborhood, and I still have locked jaw, I'm still contending with a severely bruised face, a bloodshot eye, still temporarily bringing back my hearing. And they pulled up and said, Xavier, come here, let me talk to you. When they pulled up, they said, hop in the back seat of the car, Xavier. So I hopped in the back seat of the car. And all I remember him saying is, you're going to get locked up. I was like, for what? He said, for obstruction of justice. And I didn't even know what that meant. Apparently, I had broken law of obstruction of justice. And so reflecting back upon that experience, and now as an adult, I think about victims. I think about those who have been harmed. You know, today we put guns inside of a lockbox and we place them on shelves. We protect children because we know what can happen to a child if they get a hold of a gun. But because me, as an 11-year-old kid with prior offenses, because I was no longer viewed as a child or a regular child, because I was viewed as a bad child, I didn't get no trauma therapy. I didn't get no follow-up services. I didn't get a home visit. I got a week and a half detention stay in an audio home. And that was the first time I ever been locked up. I was probably the first person in the history of the audio home to get locked up for his own shooting, you know? But I was in there, and I did that week and a half. And by the time I stood in front of a judge, I had to get my friend out of his attempted murder charges. I had to tell him what happened. But surprisingly enough, the only follow-up service I had, even beyond that, was a probation period. And I kept getting in trouble over and over again. And I asked myself, why? Why wasn't a gun? Why wasn't a bullet to my face where I almost died? Why was that not enough to wake me up? If there was ever anything in life that can perhaps wake someone up, it would be coming close to death. But that was not enough to wake me up. And now, looking back, you know, it's funny. I look at myself today as an adult, as a responsible, caring adult. And I'm afraid to get a parking ticket. You know what I mean? I don't want to get in trouble. But in reality, you know, by the time I was 13 years old, I had 19 arrests and 7 convictions. Everything from armed robbery to assault and battery, weapons possessions, all these things that I did as a child. I look back now as an adult, and I can't even imagine a child doing these things. But at the same time, now that I'm learning more about myself, now that I'm out advocating, and now I'm speaking on behalf of children who are involved in the criminal justice system, now more so than ever, learning about developmental neuroscience and what they're saying about the development of a child and how their brains are not the same as adults. I'm learning more now about myself than ever. According to recent findings of developmental neuroscience, the prefrontal cortex, which involves rational thinking and weighing of consequences and impulse control, is not fully physically formed within a child as it is within an adult. That in fact, because that lack of growth in that area is that whenever children make decisions based upon risk, they tend to rely more upon the sort of evolutionary primitive parts of your brain, which are the amygdala, which unfortunately tends to overstate reward over consequence, which unfortunately is more given to the emotional context of the situation, which is why children are so susceptible to peer pressure. These are things that we know, that parents know already. But unfortunately, the divide between developmental neuroscience and legal policy, unfortunately, is so wide that we're trying to bring it to a point where we can be empirical in our way in which we choose to address the needs of our children. Soon after I got locked up for the first-degree murder, I would say my life very early on, especially going in, was typical of that, what I experienced when I was out in free society. I was still getting in trouble. But it wasn't until I was 18 years old, when I was in Pontiac Correctional Center in segregation, that I began to mature and wake up and realize that this was not the life that I wanted to live. And I think it was because I had matured. And I think it's because I had thought about what I had done. It's because I thought about the victim, and I thought about the life that I had lived. I thought about my mom, who was still struggling with a mental disability. I thought about my brother, who was still going through hard times. I thought about my sister, who was getting involved in gangs, and I knew in my heart that has a lot to do with the environment in which these kids are being raised. There's no such thing as a bad child. And I feel blessed to be here today, but I also want to say that no child should ever have to go through what I went through to ever have arrived here, to ever have to even go through even the smallest amount of trauma that I had to go through in order to realize that I wanted to live a better life. And I say that because in reality, as adults, we have the ability to help mend the environment in which these kids are living. We have the ability to make a difference in their lives. Today, there are over 250,000 youth being charged every year as adults, as if they were adults. Kids who haven't even so much as completed high school or grade school. Kids who have never even so much as had a pair of keys or even owned a car or even learned how to drive. Are being scarred with collateral consequences that come from having an adult conviction that will follow you for the rest of your life and fully impact the full spectrum of your future opportunities in terms of education, in terms of government benefits, in terms of future employment opportunities. These are things that we are doing with our children now, that we are perpetuating a cycle of racism and incarceration that unfortunately has been impacting so many people from back of the yards, from my neighborhood and other communities that are mostly impoverished and disinvested around our country. And I say that we have the ability to make a difference. Today, there are over 2,000 individuals who are serving life without the possibility of parole. Individuals who have been in there since they were children. And little do people often talk, even think about, is the fact that the majority of these kids who went in, who are serving these life sentences without the possibility of parole, have been convicted for the very first offense. And many of these kids who are serving life without the possibility of parole, unfortunately, 40% have been accompanied by older co-defendants that played a more dominant role in the offense. Many of these kids, unfortunately, who are doing life without the possibility of parole, that although that the U.S. Supreme Court in Miller versus Alabama had decided that it was unconstitutional, that today still states are refused to allow that law to be held as retroactive to people who have been in prison for decades since they were children. This is, in my heart, an injustice. But my hope is that we continue to harvest the fruits from developmental neuroscience and legal policy, that we continue to invest in the lives of the children. I'm going to leave you with one last thought. I was talking to a good friend. His name is Fernando Moreno, and he said, Xavier, he said, we're looking for funding for our program. He said, would you believe, man, that it costs us $85,000 to house one child in a juvenile justice system? He said, don't you know if they gave me that same amount of money, I could literally employ three at-risk kids on the streets full-time for $10 an hour with the help of community partners and local businesses. He said, Xavier, according to the Illinois State Bar Association, the Illinois State is going to spend as much as $100 million to incarcerate children in our state. He said, if I only had 25% of that, $25 million, we can, with the help of local partners and businesses around our city, we could literally employ 1,200 kids full-time. There's so much more we can do with our resources in terms of being able to help our children. Our children are not super predators. Our children are not kids to be thrown away. Our children are our future. And when I think about children in general, I think about my daughter. I think about Sophia. I want her to have a better life. And I want to know that if she ever makes a mistake, that society will be forgiving. Thank you.